Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so we were talking about moving out west, we talked about the cowboys and the miners, and now we're going to talk about the people moving out west, how they moved out west, and their interactions with the Native Americans. Alright, so as settlers moved out west in the mid-1800s, there were issues that arose amongst the Native Americans and the traveling migrants. One problem that arose was the buffalo problem. That was a big problem to those American settlers out west. Plain Indians, including the Sioux, Pawnee, and the Cheyenne, made a living hunting the buffalo. It was literally used for most activities in the daily life of many of the Native Americans out in the Great Plains. Buffalo was used for food, shelter, like teepees, clothing, utensils, tools, anything you can think of they used the buffalo for. They would waste absolutely no part of the buffalo. And when the American settlers moved west, there was a desire to kill the buffalo for many reasons. So the American settlers killed the buffalo because it was hampering the expansion of the railroad, number one. Buffalo were constantly being a nuisance to these rail cars, herding across the tracks, stalling transportation. And I mean, these herds numbered in the millions sometimes and spanned miles long and miles wide, leaving the railroad literally stuck in one place for a couple of hours. It could sometimes take a couple of hours for this herd to move past the railroad track. The next reason was that some settlers felt that if they were able to rid the plains of the buffalo, meaning get rid of all the buffalo on the plains, they would solve the native problem. Meaning that if they got rid of the food source and the livelihood of the Native Americans, they would actually eliminate the Native Americans. And these conflicts grew with the Plains Indians as miners and settlers increased in numbers out in the West. And if they could starve out the Native Americans, they would be able to take over that area. And the plains people, the settlers, did use the buffalo for a food source as well, but really their main problem was trying to get rid of Native Americans. There's a picture right there of how much they depended on the buffalo. So during the U.S. expansion, the U.S. government negotiated treaties with the Plain Indians to gain more western land for settlers. Now you have to understand, these treaties were unfair to the Native Americans on many different levels. The treaties offered Native Americans money for their lands that definitely did not meet the land value. The treaties were unfair because of language barriers and trickery. They would try to fool the Native American tribe and the Native American leaders into signing these unfair treaties. And the United States wanted to gain control of the land at any cost. They would do anything to get any of the land out there. In 1851, the Treaty of Fort Laramie recognized this Native American lands to the Great Plains. So in 1851, the United States says, hey, you Native Americans have claim to the Great Plains. The only thing that the U.S. government wanted to do on that land is it said, hey, you get the plains, and the U.S. government can build forts and travel across these Native American lands without being attacked. So that was the original deal between the United States government and the Great Plains tribes. However, that was only temporary until the discovery of gold out in the Black Hills. The United States government would ultimately renegotiate their old treaties or even negotiate new treaties, sending Native Americans to live on reservations, which were areas of federal land set aside for them. So you had some other Native Americans who would call for reform in the 1870s, but here's what I want you to know about these treaties with the United States. They were always unfair, number one. Number two, these treaties were negotiated a couple of times. They were never set in the way. they would get a treaty, and you will see, because we'll cover the second treaty of Fort Laramie. So they renegotiate them, or they just trash them and renegotiate new ones. Most Southern Plains Indians agreed to go to reservations under the 1867 Treaty of Medicine Lodge. To say agree is kind of an insult, but they were forced to go to these reservations in Medicine Lodge and the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868. However, the movement of pioneers and miners across the Great Plains and through Native American hunting grounds led to many conflicts with the Sioux tribe led by Crazy Horse. So when the Native Americans resisted confinement on reservations, the government sent in the army and again led a forced removal of the Native American to reservations. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Native Americans being forced to move or relocate by the army again. The soldiers sent to corral these Native Americans included the famous African American cavalry called the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers helped protect the settlers and fight the natives. And most of the natives had stopped fighting by the 1880s, except for the Apache, who was led by Geronimo, and they fought until about the mid-1886. So you have these African-American Civil War soldiers going out west, protecting the miners, and battling the Native Americans. Now, there were plenty of battles. All the time there was battles with the natives. And one in particular that I'm going to come over here is the Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, in order to protect gold miners, led troops to destroy the Lakota Sioux in South Dakota. Custer took his roughly 200 soldiers into a battle with some 2,000 well-equipped Sioux forces led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, Custer and all of his men were killed that day, pretty much cementing Custer in history, while the battle was the Sioux's last major victory. And later, in retaliation for Custer's last stand, which is what it's called, the United States troops massacred about 150 Sioux, including women and children, in a massacre at Wounded Knee. Now, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, he was not the only person with 200 soldiers against 2,000 of the Sioux. He was just antsy to get in there and get fighting these Sioux. He really felt that with his men he'd be able to destroy them. There were two other garrisons, I guess you would say, with him. So there were three large portions of the U.S. Army out there. Custer just went right up the gut and wound up with about 50 of his guys on that last little hill where he's at, and we call that Custer's last stand. And you'll be able to see the tombstones that I took pictures of when I was there at Little Bighorn, to show you about really how close they all were when Custer and his last 50 men or so were slaughtered on that hill. So Native American tribes and U.S. Army fought all of the time out in the West. So we have, Western tribes. We have the Navajo people who refused to settle on reservations, and this ultimately led to their demise. The U.S. troops raided the Navajo fields, the homes, and livestock, and left the Navajo with nothing. So out of food and out of shelter, the Navajo surrendered. The U.S. Army then forced the Navajo on a 300-mile march known as the Long Walk to a reservation where countless people died. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like the Trail of Tears. And we have a story of the Northwest Nez Perce tribe and the United States government betrayal. First, the U.S. promised to let the Nez Perce keep their Oregon land. Yes, but what did we say about the government and any type of treaties with Native Americans? This one, again, was thrown away. This was until the settlers wanted to use that land that the natives were promised. And then the government said, you know what? I think we're going to go ahead and give that land. We're going to take it away from the natives, and we're going to give it to the settlers. So they demanded this land from the Native Americans, and then when they didn't get it like that, they had to go in there, and the U.S. Army troops went in there, fighting ensued, and the troops forced the Nez Perce onto a reservation in Oklahoma, where many more died. So we have the U.S. Army forcing Native Americans onto reservations throughout the whole settlement in the western part of the United States. A couple things that the U.S. government, number one, was afraid of, and number two, tried to do to Native Americans. Number one, the government was afraid of the ghost dance movement. The Native Americans needed a way to deal with all this betrayal and hard luck that was going on. The U.S. government was just stepping all over them. So they created the ghost dance movement that predicted the arrival of paradise for Native Americans. And this was misunderstood by U.S. officials who feared that it was a grow up or a lead to rebellion. And there were many times skirmishes could have broken out, but they gradually died out over time after the Wounded Knee Massacre. And the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887. So one way the federal government tried to assimilate the Native Americans to quote-unquote whiteness was with the Dawes General Allotment Act. This act made land ownership among Native Americans private. Usually Native Americans didn't practice private land ownership. They would share the land and have communal gardens and hunting grounds. The idea of private land ownership, along with the forced spread of Christianity, tried to encourage the Native Americans to lessen their traditional influences and to encourage them to adopt the ways of white people. And this act also resulted in taking away about 2/3 of the Native American land. So as you can see, what we discussed here quickly is that during westward expansion, the U.S. government, American settlers, really did not get along with. They wanted the land, and they didn't like the Native Americans. And the U.S. Army had to go out there plenty of times to go out there and take this land forcefully or through unfair treaties and push all the native tribes onto reservations.